Hello, I'm Dr. Rachel Connor. I'm a radiologist by training. I don't have any public health qualifications and I'm not a geohydrologist. Nevertheless, what I'm going to show you today I think will both surprise you and shock you. Did you know, for example, that wind farm construction may be linked to causing cancer? We all know that noise from wind farms is intrusive and can cause health problems for residential neighbours. But most people are not aware that wind farms can also cause serious problems in both public and private water supplies, and that this affects not just wind farm neighbours, but thousands of people living in towns and cities. I'm going to show you this evidence. The data underpinning this damning evidence comes from Scottish Water and Scottish Power Renewables, but the conclusions, the graphs that I've drawn from this data, and the opinions that I express are my own. This is a statement made by the World Health Organization in 1996 that all people have a right to a supply of clean, safe drinking water, and that should be no more true than here in Scotland, where we have an abundance of natural resources, in particular wind and water. So welcome to Scotland. This is what the tourist board would have you think of when you think about Scotland. Unspoilt landscapes, beautiful lochs and reservoirs, only disturbed perhaps by the occasional fish and angler, and if you're lucky, a bright blue sky. But this, unfortunately, is now the reality. This is our landscape, trashed by industrial turbines. This is Whiteley Wind Farm, the largest onshore wind farm in the UK, with 215 turbines at up to 140 metres in height. And I have the misfortune of living at the bottom right of this photograph. What I want you to notice in particular though from this photograph is the reservoirs and just how close these turbines are in proximity to the water's edge. This is what I'm going to talk about today. In the bottom middle of this photograph is Craigendunton Reservoir, which is our local reservoir. So what does happen when you build a wind farm next to a reservoir? Well, the first thing that happens is that heavy earth-moving equipment moves in to build new access roads. And this in itself is going to disturb and probably destroy the soil surface, but that's made worse by the deforestation, the cutting down of the commercial forestry. And all this will combine to churn up the surface soil and expose the underlying peat, which can become unstable and liquefied. And this peat may be up to 8 metres in depth, for example at Whiteley. All that is made even worse by the digging of turbine foundations, which can be up to 40 feet deep. And again, the multiple vehicle movements necessary to bring in the turbine components will only add to the surface disturbance. And all this together with drips from engines, gear oil drips, and the occasional diesel spill, combined with what in the west of Scotland is almost continuous rain, has the potential to wash downhill and into the reservoir. But of course, any self-respecting wind farm construction company will tell you that they put mitigation in place to stop exactly this happening. But unfortunately, this mitigation, these sediment traps, are often overwhelmed by the volume of liquefied peat and the rain washing down, so that there is the potential still for these contaminants to wash into the reservoir and cause water contamination. And this is Craigendunton Reservoir, our local reservoir which supplies water to the Amlaird water treatment works to 50,000 homes in North Kilmarnock and the Irvine Valley. Before we point the finger of blame at anybody for contaminating the water, it's important for us to understand what was going on in the construction period at any one particular time. This is an example of the Scottish Power Renewables Whiteley Extension 1 and 2 construction schedule, and I also have the original Whiteley construction schedule. What it shows is that most of the heavy earthworks occurred for the extension between November 2010 and December 2011, although it's apparent that a lot of these earthworks and construction works were going on after December 2011, and that was also apparent from site visits. Let's look in a little more detail as to what actually happened in the raw water from Craigandunton Reservoir during those construction periods. Many Scottish reservoirs have a problem with brown and discoloured water, which is usually due to excessive dissolved peat, but also reflects the amount of iron and manganese in the water, and this can vary considerably over the course of the year according to the season and the amount of rainfall. But what happened here, if we superimpose the construction periods, is that during the building of Whiteley Extensions 1 and 2, the spikes of iron in the raw water almost doubled, and similarly the manganese content of the water also went up, much more than you'd expect to see with seasonal variation. During the original Whiteley construction, these changes were less marked because the turbines were very much further away from Craigandunton. And during this period in 2011, Scottish Water was successfully prosecuted for recurrent discharge of excessive manganese and iron polluting the nearby burn of Crawfordland from the Amled water treatment works. And you can see from the photograph below that this is really pretty disgusting stuff that's being discharged. But it's not just an increase in the amount of iron and manganese and peat in the untreated water that's feeding into the treatment works. During that construction period, there was also a huge spike in the amount of bacteria. And you might say, well, what does it matter? Because after all, that water is being fed into the water treatment works, and that is the function of that plant, to make the water safe for public consumption. But Amled Water Treatment Works was largely rebuilt in 2005 at a cost of several £1 million, but that water treatment works was completely overwhelmed by the dirty water that was coming into it. And remember those discharges that were happening into the local burn. So what does happen in a water treatment works? Well, this diagram is a very simplistic representation of what happens. The dirty raw water is fed into the treatment works and filtered as much as possible to remove any debris, as much peat as possible, and also iron and manganese. Chlorine is then added to the residual water to make it safe to drink. Unfortunately, the reaction of chlorine with any residual organic matter in the water produces noxious substances called trihalomethanes within the public water supply. And I'm going to talk in more detail about what these substances are. What are trihalomethanes? Well, the Drinking Water Quality Regulator for Scotland defines these trihalomethanes, or THMs for short, as compounds that form when you add chlorine to disinfect water that contains organic material. So this only occurs in the public water supply. It doesn't occur in private water supplies where no chlorine is added. At a chemical level, a trihalomethane, a THM, is essentially just a molecule of methane which is carbon surrounded by 4 hydrogen atoms, and when you add chlorine to this, these hydrogen atoms are replaced by the chlorine atoms. You can add other halogens such as bromine, and this produces a more complex molecule, but usually it's chloroform that is the predominant THM that's formed. So does chloroform cause any harm? Well, we've all seen the old black and white movies where the villain gets out the bottle of chloroform and a wad of cotton wool and puts it over the hapless victim's mouth and puts them to sleep. And this lady, Queen Victoria, was a great fan of chloroform. She used it as an analgesia, as pain relief during her multiple childbirths. And she should know because she had quite a number of children. But she doesn't know how lucky she was. Chloroform is actually a poisonous anaesthetic agent which is no longer used. It can cause acute liver failure and acute kidney failure. So this could well have changed the face of the monarchy forever. But it's not the large quantities of chloroform that we're concerned about here. It's small quantities of chloroform that are absorbed and ingested over a number of years. And it's looking at the long-term effects of what this does to us. This is truly a smoking gun. Do you remember this photograph? This shocking image was taken by Mary Baird, a journalist who undercover infiltrated the laboratories of a tobacco company who were forcing these beagles to smoke up to 30 cigarettes a day to try and prove that they didn't get lung cancer. Of course, we all know differently now. But it took Mary Baird almost 6 months to get this photograph published in papers. And it took more than 50 years for tobacco companies to admit liability, to admit that cigarettes cause lung cancer. And we all know, of course, that cigarettes and carcinogens in tobacco do cause lung cancer. And this is put on the back of cigarette packets in Canada to try and persuade people not to smoke. And trihalomethanes are probably carcinogens. This means that they can cause cancer just like cigarettes and asbestos. But the cancer-producing effects of carcinogens often take 10 or sometimes even 20 years, by which time the underlying cause of the cancer has often been long forgotten. But the effects of raised THMs in water are recognised as a problem worldwide by water authorities, and as such, regulatory limits on the amount of THM in water are set, also here in Scotland. Most of the experiments showing that THMs can cause cancer have occurred in laboratory animals, mice and rats, and in these animals there has been shown to be an increase in liver cancer and also kidney tumours. And these validated experiments have been recognised by the World Health Organization, who have set their own regulatory standards for allowable limits of THMs in public water supplies. But man is neither rat nor mouse. Man lives for 70 to 80 years compared to the approximately 2 years for a mouse or a rat, and laboratory animals are exposed to high levels of THMs, whereas man has the potential to be exposed to low doses for a much longer period. So the problem is that the biological effects are probably different, and the potential for different cancers are also probably different. Obviously, you can't experiment directly on people, and so most of the studies that have been done in North America look at populations where they normally have a higher than average amount of THM in their public water supply, and looking at the increase of cancers or other illness over what would be expected as a background. And these population epidemiological studies have shown that there is a higher than expected rate, particularly of bladder cancer, but also of rectal cancers. There are some other effects too, such as fatty livers and changes on fertility, but these effects are generally less well substantiated. What's important to realise, though, is that chloroform can be absorbed through the public water, not just by drinking it, but also through the skin. So, for example, if you had a shower, you would absorb water not only by ingesting it, but also through inhaling it in the steam and also through your skin in the hot water. So what did actually happen to the public water supply from Amlaird water treatment works during the construction period at Whiteley? I want you first to look at this graph at the dotted black lines, and these represent the regulatory limits for THMs in the water supply from the USA, the lower one, at 80 parts per million, and at the higher limit, 20% higher, for Scotland at 100 micrograms, 100 parts per million in water. And the reason the USA set a lower standard or lower limit for THM in the public water is because they recognise that the chronic long-term effects of THMs in the water and the effects on the population are not yet fully understood, so they take a much more cautious approach than here in Scotland. Then I want you to turn your attention to the solid red line, and this represents the actual measurement of THM in the public water supply over the construction period and on either side. And look particularly at this spike that occurs during the construction period at Whiteley. And there are further diminishing spikes, which we'll talk about in a moment. But remember that the actual earthworks and construction went on well beyond that period in early 2012. What's important to realise here is that these spikes represent higher than acceptable levels of THM in the public water supply. And if we take that whole period when these spikes are above the black dotted line, then by Scottish standards this means that the population of North Kilmarnock and the Irvine Valley were exposed to carcinogens in their water for approximately 9 months higher than acceptable limits. And if we take the USA standards, then the population was exposed for 19 months. What we're looking at here is the second of those peaks and why we apparently had further spikes occurring after that maximum construction period. And unfortunately I don't have all the data from Amlaird, but what this shows is that this spike in the THMs, the red spike here, was really caused by the huge spike of organic matter of carbon within Craigandunton Reservoir water, within the raw water. You'll remember that I said that THMs are only formed when you add chlorine to water that has a high organic content. This is exactly what happened at Amlaird. Scottish Water set a regulatory limit for the amount of chlorine that can be added to water to make it safe to drink at 1 milligram per litre, although most people can actually taste chlorine in their water at half this level, at 0.5 milligrams per litre. But during that construction period at Whiteley, the amount of chlorine that was added at Amlaird water treatment works to the public water was more than double the allowable limit. And this contributed to the formation of THMs in the public water supply. Most English water companies will aim to keep the amount of chlorine added to the water at 0.5 milligrams per litre or less. So why did Amlaird add quite so much chlorine to the public water? Well, you remember this is the graph of the bacteria present within the raw water at Craigandunton Reservoir, and this explains why Amlaird put so much chlorine in the water to make it safe to drink. There was this huge, unprecedented spike in the amount of bacteria in the raw water coming into the treatment works. So did they succeed? Was the public water supply safe to drink? Well, the one standard that Scottish Water really strive to achieve is that the water should have a 0 bacterial count. And in this critical period of 2011, during the construction period, you can see that Scottish Water didn't even manage to achieve that standard, that there were bacteria in the public water supply despite the amount of chlorine that had been added. I was so concerned about what I had found out that I wrote to my local MSP, Willie Coffey, and he in turn wrote to Scottish Water and Scottish Power Renewables. Don't forget that all the data that I've shown you has come from Scottish Water and Scottish Power Renewables. This is Scottish Water's reply to Mr. Coffey. And in particular, I draw your attention to the final paragraph, which is, our public health team and water operations team are unaware of any water quality failures or contamination events at Amled water treatment works. I leave you to draw your own conclusions. This man needs no further introduction. Alex Salmond, First Minister for Scotland. Although he does look in this photograph as though he's about to lay an egg, no, sorry, he passed a motion. Well, actually, his government passed a bill in 2010 which allowed Scottish Water to partner with renewable energy companies to develop renewable energy projects on their land. And that was a major departure from previous policy to allow industrialisation on water catchment areas. And let's not forget, Scottish Water is a publicly owned body, and this is publicly owned land, our land. And there are 80,000 acres of that land and more, all ripe for renewable development. So perhaps that explains why Scottish Water were a little bit coy about admitting that there were water quality problems on land which has turbine development. They stand to gain millions of pounds over the next 25 years in rent from various renewable energy companies for allowing that development, that industrialisation of our water catchment areas. You may think that the problems that I've described in relation to Craigandunton and Whiteley Wind Farm are an isolated problem, but I believe that this is probably happening right across Scotland, affecting reservoirs that have wind farm development around them. This is Backwater Reservoir in Angus, and there is a proposed Macritch Hill wind farm surrounding the reservoir, which has been in the development and planning stage for almost 2 years. Originally, its 33 turbines were proposed to be sited on the top of the hills surrounding the reservoir, but because this is right next to Cairngorms National Park, which is top left in this photo montage, it was judged that the visual impact was too great on the national park. So more recent plans have sited these turbines much, much closer to the water's edge. And now, of course, we're very much aware of what happens to the water quality in the reservoir when you construct a wind farm. And this reservoir doesn't just supply 50,000 people. This reservoir supplies 300,000 people with their water in Dundee, Angus, Perth and Kinross. And I don't suppose Scottish Water and Eneco Wind, who are the developers of Macritch Hill Wind Farm, and they look very happy in this photograph, are aware at all of the impact on public health. I don't suppose they would even care. It seems to me that here are profits being put ahead of public health. I think it's about time we looked at this whole situation more carefully. This is like playing Russian roulette with people's health. Which person is going to fall ill in the future because of this wind farm development? But Scottish Water stand to gain approximately £300 million a year from renewable energy developments on their or our land, and this is set to increase 15-fold in 7 years' time by 2020. And I'm not the first person, and I'm sure I won't be the last person, to notice that Scottish water quality is worse than in England and Wales. Jane Bradley, writing in The Scotsman in 2013, wrote that almost 3% of more than 15,000 water samples taken did not comply with standards for trihalomethanes. I think that is a shocking indictment. So if public water supplies have problems with trihalomethanes and the odd bacteria, what happens to private water supplies? Well, really, this is how it all started for us. There are about 75,000 private water supplies in Scotland, and as you'd imagine, these are almost all rural. So who is responsible for protecting your supply in the face of adjacent industrialisation? Well, before I answer that question, let's look a little bit more closely about what happens when you try and extract water from a borehole for your supply. I'm not a geohydrologist, but this is what I understand is a fairly typical scenario for domestic borehole extraction in the west of Scotland with a fairly typical geology. There's often a variable amount of surface soil sitting on top of a variable depth of peat. Underneath this there is boulder clay, which has often rock scattered through it, and below this loose gravel and rock. Below this layer there is a more solid layer of impermeable rock, and above this is the water table. And it's important to realise that the water table is not horizontal, but actually slopes downhill to the nearest reservoir or river. And of course, because it's Scotland, it's probably going to rain quite a lot, and the water percolates down through these various layers, becoming cleaner as it does so. And most domestic boreholes will try and access this clean water, often at a depth of about 200 feet or so. So when you have a wind farm construction that's uphill from the borehole, the first thing that happens is that the earth-moving equipment moves in and constructs the access roads. Then there are the digging of borrow pits or quarries, and these will extend down to a depth to be able to access the loose gravel and rock and the solid rock to form turbine foundations and more access roads. The turbine foundations, down to about 40 feet or so, are trying to access the solid ground, often the rock, so that the turbine itself is stable. And the effect of digging effectively these holes through the various layers of soil and clay means that any surface water which has been contaminated with diesel drips, gear oil, even loose soil, have the potential, instead of being filtered through the various layers, they have the potential to go straight down and into the water table and then running much unimpeded downhill, where the domestic borehole can effectively suck up the unfiltered water. So what happened to our private water supply? Well, our private water supply comes from an underground spring with the water catchment area now covered with Whiteley turbines. Scottish Power Renewables never bothered to find out where our water was coming from before they built the wind farm. Our water goes into a collection tank where it then serves 10 properties. Scottish Power Renewables had been monitoring our water for 7 years during the various phases of development. During that period, several of us in our small community were actually seriously ill, along with some of our guests. What Scottish Power Renewables didn't tell us and didn't tell any statutory authority was that we had very severe bacterial contamination of our water. At one point here in 2010, 170,000 bacteria per 100 mils of water. That's like drinking an untreated urinary tract infection, and it's no wonder so many of us were ill at various times. Our local MSP, Mr. Willie Coffey, wrote to Scottish Power Renewables with our concerns, and this was their reply. Scottish Power Renewables essentially deny that they had any contribution towards our bacterial contamination. But I want to draw your attention to the last sentence, and the bit in red in particular. Scottish Power Renewables feel that the only way that you can prove that wind farm construction have caused water contamination is by measuring the diesel and oil and particulate matter contaminants within the water. So, this is what Scottish Water routinely test for as their test parameters. And in yellow I put Scottish Power's test parameters that they tested for in our water. So Scottish Power Renewables tested for bacteria, for the cloudiness of the water, and for the acidity of the water here. Nowhere does it mention that they tested for any of diesel, oil, or solid particulate matter contaminants in our water. So effectively, ignorance is bliss. If you don't test for contaminants, then you're never going to find it. And the same can actually be said for Scottish Water, who obviously have the turbines on their land. Nowhere in this list of routine test parameters does Scottish Water test for public water, or I should say the public reservoir raw water contamination. So who is responsible for your water quality? Well, SEPA, the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, are responsible for the general water environment, so the water runoff in ditches and rivers from the development site. They're also responsible for making sure that any diesel spills are properly cleaned up. The Drinking Water Quality Regulator is the watchdog for standards of Scotland's water quality for both public and private water supplies. And Scottish Water are responsible for testing and supplying public water. The local authority is responsible for testing of private water supplies, perhaps at the householder's expense, and reporting those results to the Drinking Water Quality Regulator. They are, in theory, responsible for protecting private water supplies, although I found this to be a somewhat grey area. But the wind farm developer is responsible for actually testing private water supplies during construction. And that seems to me like putting the fox not in charge of the hen house, but in the hen house. Nobody seems to take responsibility for telling the wind farm developer what to test for and how often to test for it. When I was looking into the scale of the problem of water contamination caused by wind farm construction across the UK, I was horrified by what I found. I think the public have been blinded by thinking that renewable energy is green and therefore kind to the environment. This is what's happening in our own country. This is in Essex. This is Bradwell Wind Farm, and here is a wind farm access road being constructed. In the foreground there's this rather grey amorphous material here, and this is incinerator base aggregate, IBA. This is a period of heavy rainfall, as you can see, and the road is flooded. And on either side of this access road is prime agricultural land, I think probably potatoes growing here on the left. And this is a closer look at this grey aggregate. You can see that it's very unstable, it doesn't bind very well, and it's washing away into the adjacent water courses. And this is 10,000 tonnes of London's incinerator waste being dumped on prime agricultural land. Totally uncontrolled landfill. There is no idea of what's in it, but what you can see here is that there's half-burnt bits of plastic, cutlery, There's even a blue nitrile glove, the kind of thing that you would see in hospital clinical waste. You could make a real meal out of it. But what kind of toxins are leaching into the water supply? And this is Batu in China. This is where neodymium, the rare earth metal that's used in the nacelle at the top of the turbine to make the electricity, is mined. It's one of the very few places on the planet where this is done. And just look at the damage it's done. Look at the chimneys that are spouting out toxic fumes and smoke. There is no point if Scotland is reducing the CO2 emissions by less than 1%, if the same air that we breathe on the other side of the planet is spewing out these fumes. And look at the 6 Mile lake in front of the furnaces. Toxic waste. And this was once prime agricultural land. The crops have now died. The animals have died. The children have got ill. Many of them have had cancer. And these are two of the locals. And this man here is wearing gloves. And doesn't that just say it all? So where are we now? I think we're in a long, dark place, and nobody seems to want to listen. I think our government have been blinded by the short-term gains of renewable energy, potentially at the expense of our people's health in years to come. So if nobody is listening, is there anything we can do? Well, I think there are things that we can do that will help. You need to lobby your MP or MSP and find out what effects wind farm developments will have on your reservoir water quality and public water supplies. If there are wind farm planning applications in the pipeline, check that your local authority asks for a geohydrology report in the environmental statement. Look at the impact on private water supplies and on reservoir water quality. And lastly, if you live in Scotland, you can apply for an £800 non-means tested grant if you have a private water supply, and this will at least remove the bacteria from your water. 1 in 3 people in the UK will get cancer. Scotland has some of the worst cancer rates in Europe, and on the 29th of July, the BBC News reported that cancer rates have actually increased in Scotland. So if you're one of those unlucky people who gets bladder cancer or rectal cancer in years to come, will you be wondering whether the water that you drank today has contributed towards that? We shouldn't take water for granted. It's a precious resource, but we do need to question what comes out of our taps. Thank you very much.